Hi. I want to introduce Dr. Turney, who's our new president of the Boston Society. Dr. Turney is interested in changing the name to include neurosurgery, I understand.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Well, I'm Travis Tierney. I'm a member of the Department of Neurosurgery, and I understand there's been another leader of this society that was a neurosurgeon, so I don't think we probably have to change the name. But I thank you for inviting me to do this. It's a great honor. It's a great honor to introduce Marty Samuels, who really needs no introduction, I think, to this group here. You've all known him a lot longer than I probably have. He's had a long and distinguished career, and one of his focuses, a central focus of his career, is the nexus between medicine and neurology, and he has researched and talked extensively about neurocardiology. I'll just say in a personal note that I have gotten to know Marty rather well in the last few years since I've been here. I occasionally have had a heart palpitation that is caused by my job, and I've had the fortunate chance to sit down and talk with Marty in his office, and he's always put me in a really nice rhythm, and I think once you probably even cardioverted me, so thank you. He's going to talk tonight on Voodoo Death Revisited, Boston's part in the heart-brain connection.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to step aside. I don't stand behind these podia too well. Are you able to hear me well enough? Thanks for inviting me to lead off the year here. When I mentioned that I was giving this talk, or it was mentioned that I was giving this talk at the Associate Editors meeting of the Annals of Neurology, which is held in Cliff Saper's office every Tuesday. He said, "Well, I think I've heard that you've given this talk before," which is an understatement, right? And I've been interested in this for a very, very long time, and I have been a lot of places to talk, but there's no place more meaningful to me than to be asked by my friends at home to talk about this subject. And particularly in this room, as you'll see, because we really are in a spot here where a lot of the ideas were generated for this group of concepts that we're going to talk about today. For some of you, I imagine, think of this as going to see Casablanca or something like it, in that you might know exactly what all the jokes are and what the lines are. And Jerry Winkler said that he was waiting for a specific line. So I'm not going to disappoint you, Jerry. I will deliver some of these lines, but I hope to give you a perspective on this that has gradually developed over a very long period of time. And I'm going to take you on a tour which includes these figures and pictures and people that you see on this first slide. And at the end, I want to draw it together as an example of the influence of the nervous system on the visceral organs, or what I like to call the lower organs, any organ other than the brain. I don't have any important conflict of interest with regard to this problem. I want to emphasize that none of these ideas that I'm going to talk about today are mine. I don't take any credit for any of these ideas. I've simply been here and watched them develop over the last almost 50 years, I was figuring out. From the very first time I thought about the heart-brain connection, and I'll tell you when that happened, until now, that these ideas are passed from brain to brain. We host them for a while, and then we pass them on. And of course, in this era of such rapid communication, this can happen in microseconds. Ideas can move around the world in a very rapid pace. And the good ones last and the bad ones disappear, just like the genes. This group of ideas has evolved. It's bubbled up over time. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. Not take any credit for it at all. That's not false modesty. That's just a fact. This is, a lot of people like to show the members of their lab. So I wanted you to see the members of my lab. I don't have pictures of all of them. But it's a good lab. It's a good group of people. I'm going to mention a lot of these people here One or two of them are actually here in this room. People that have had very important influences over my own thinking about this and who have really made the contributions that are important in this field. Now, I'm going to talk about a number of different streams of thought which I think converge into a unifying hypothesis, or at least something that we can test. One of the oldest ones is the phenomenon of sudden death from fright. I'm going to start with talking about sudden death from fright. Then we're going to talk a little bit about electrocardiography and then cardiac function. And then finally, I'll try to put this together for you. This is a remarkable story from the New Testament. It's from the book of Acts. I show you this not out of some religiosity on my part. I, as far as I know, do not have temporal lobe epilepsy. And I have not had an overwhelming interest in religion. But I think that this is a remarkable story. It's a story that many of you know about Ananias and Sapphira. They're a husband and wife who sell a possession. They fail to give the church the tax. St. Peter hears about this. He calls them into his office, and he reads the riot act to the husband, Ananias, and says, "You've lied to me, you've lied to God." And you can see here that it says, as he hears those words, that's verse 5, he falls down and gives up the ghost, drops dead from the fright of what's been threatened. That's interesting, but even more interesting is what happened in the next 3 hours, because the wife, who had not heard about this, comes in 3 hours later. The body has been carried off and buried. And Peter says to her, "Were you involved in this fraud? Because if you were, those boys who just left have just buried your husband, and they've come to bury you." At which point she drops dead, and they bury her by her husband. So there's 2 cases of voodoo death in a period of 3 hours. Now, what does it have to do with the location in which we are sitting today? This is a photograph, as you can see, of the opening of the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in 1917, 1918. It's quite remarkable that at this very moment this entry is being redone, and in a week or two there's going to be a rededication of this space. And it is nice to rehabilitate our only decent building here at the Brigham. That beautiful Georgian building, the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital. We don't have time to talk about how it happened to get there, but the important thing, of course, about hospitals, unlike what many people now say, is not the hospital itself or the bricks and mortar, but the people. So the question was, who were there on the day they opened the hospital almost exactly 100 years ago? So here's a photograph. You can see exactly where it is. It's taken from Pat's Place outward, and you're looking at the Harvard Medical School in the background. The medical school had just been moved there in 1904 from Copley Square, and one of the main figures in convincing the president of Harvard to move that medical school was Walter Cannon, who felt that there weren't enough laboratories to do proper modern medical science in Copley Square, and that they needed to move the hospital to this new location, which was in a swamp. They had to pump the water out of the swamp. There were mosquitoes here. There was malaria, literally. It was way in the sticks. Nobody wanted to come out here, but he moved the hospital nonetheless. Sort of interesting how history repeats itself. Look at the Cambridge and Alston campus, how difficult it was to think about Harvard University crossing the river with a science campus. In any case, there they are. You can see Walter Cannon. I've only marked a few of these people here. Cannon was the chair of physiology at the Harvard Medical School just across Shattuck Street. And there he was at the opening of the hospital. Isn't that a wonderful symbol? Wish we had it today. The professor of physiology was attached so tightly to this new hospital, which was supposed to be the Hopkins of the North. That is to say, it was supposed to be bedside teaching, and it was the concept behind it was impregnated into the builders of the Brigham by Harvey Cushing, who you can see with his little bow tie standing in the back. He had learned this idea from the man standing in front of him with the bowler hat, and that, of course, is Osler, who was his mentor. Another interesting bit of history that an internist mentored a surgeon. Think about that happening today. They were practically like father and son, as you know. Cushing spent many evenings in Osler's home, called him W.O., and sadly had to had to try to save Osler's son on the battlefield in France and failed to do so. Osler came from the opening of the hospital, as you see here, and patting his student on the back. And this place really was supposed to be the Hopkins of the North. It was next to the medical school, and they were supposed to do clinical pathological correlation. It was all supposed to be disease-oriented medicine. But if you look at this picture with 100 years of perspective, I think you can see that this is a group of people who were going to work on the connection between the heart and the brain. Of course, they didn't know that at the time. They, of course, had no idea that they were there at a very special and unusual time. But in retrospect, we can see that they were. Here's a photograph taken about 15 years later when Ivan Pavlov came to Boston for the physiology meetings and actually stayed at Walter Cannon's house. And as you see him here, literally passing the baton from Ivan Pavlov to Walter Cannon, the great physiologist. The important moments here that occurred at the Brigham to bring the right people together occurred in 1939 when, let me find him for you, Selma Weiss, who's right there with his hands in his pockets, who was the chair. He had just come over here from Boston City Hospital, recruited 2 people. He actually recruited 4 people altogether to run the entire inpatient service. Somebody for infectious diseases, a guy named Janeway, who you may have heard of. Somebody for general medicine, and somebody for neurology and psychiatry. And here they were, John Romano, a neuropsychiatrist, functioning more as a psychiatrist in the modern sense than a neurologist, was brought over from the city. And shortly thereafter, he recruited George Engel, who had a brother, as you probably know, both of whom trained here at the Brigham in internal medicine. George Engel's brother died of sudden death. Engel became obsessed with the fear of sudden death, that he might himself be at risk for sudden death, spent most of his life on this model, the psychosocial model of biology, which he believed there was an extremely important connection somehow between the nervous system and the visceral organs. Thankfully, he lived a long life. He ended up going from here to the University of Cincinnati, and from there to the University of Rochester, where he ended his career in life. And that's where Romano and Engel ended their lives. While they were here, they really invented the field of clinical psychosomatic, so-called psychosomatic medicine, the effect on the visceral organs of nervous system function. The reason I honor Cannon with the title of this talk is because of this paper, which was published, as you see, in an anthropology journal in 1942. This is the year of Cannon's retirement as the chair of physiology at the Harvard Medical School. It was, in a way, his crowning achievement. He wanted to summarize some of his important thoughts about visceral control. The picture of Cannon there, as you see, is an older man, is mine. I intercalated it there. And to the right of that, you see something called the pointing bone, which Cannon mentions in his paper, but I just wanted you to see what it looked like. This is a photograph taken from the British Museum of a pointing bone. This is a bone with a shank of hair on it that is pointed at somebody in a tribe, in a group, who has transgressed a rule of some kind. Cannon reports in this paper that this is a very effective way of clearing out the department. So when the new chair comes in, they point the pointing bone. He gives several examples of this. I won't tell you all the examples, but they're very, very colorful examples of people who were frightened to death. And at the end of this paper, Cannon hypothesizes, based on the experiments that he had done all these years in the laboratory, combined with these anthropological experiments of nature, that this was due to what he called an autonomic storm. It's remarkable how accurate Cannon often was in his predictions of what would probably be the ultimate answer to a problem. And I'll come back to sympathetic storm at the end. Here's a more modern case of a child who was being treated by a doctor for a disease, and the treatment consisted of putting a guinea hen on the child's head. This guinea hen was alive just moments before this photograph was snapped. The treatment consisted of the doctor and his associates circling the child and the animal. and producing a pulsating crescendo sound with their voices. They did not touch this hen or this child. You can see that the hen has dropped dead. That's considered to be a successful cure. The idea being that the illness must have come up out of the child into the hen, and the hen had died. In actual fact, of course, they had no follow-up on the children and didn't know whether it was a cure or wasn't. But that isn't the interesting part of the story. Is that the interesting thing is that these doctors could frighten a guinea hen to death without touching it. How often could they do it successfully? Well, it turns out it was about 20%. This cure worked about 20% of the time, which isn't bad because that would mean that it would be equal to the effectiveness of aspirin for the secondary prevention of stroke. In other words, this would be approved by the FDA, I think, this treatment. Many, many animals, of course, are susceptible to this. Some of you have actually probably observed animals frightened to death by other animals. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'm just going to give you a reference to it. This is an amazing domestic case of the Siamese twins, Chang and Eng, who, as you know, were born in Siam. They were connected by a xiphoid band. As you can see, here's an ancient picture of them with their tennis racket. Chang is the man looking straight at you, and Eng is the man looking straight at you, and Chang is looking to the left. That's their usual posture. They were sold to the merchant marines that they brought to the United States, joined the circus, and became known as the Siamese twins. They traveled around the world. They became quite successful and wealthy. The xiphoid band was never cut. They were afraid that something vital was in it. And there's an interesting Boston piece of the story in that they went to see Dr. Warren at the Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the great surgeons and founders of the MGH, for an opinion. And he fed asparagus to one of them and smelled the urine of the other one. And when he smelled the asparagus ester, he opined that it was too dangerous to separate them. There's something vital in the connection between the two of them. So they lived this way 63 years. This is their marriage picture. They married two sisters from North Carolina. They retired in North Carolina from the circus. They married two sisters. They were not conjoined. But in this situation, living in two homes about a mile apart in North Carolina, they had 21 children. One had 10. The other had 11. Just make a visual picture of that just for a minute. And there are hundreds of descendants of the Siamese twins still living in North Carolina. That's not the reason I show you this, though. I show it to you because of the day of their death. You can see them here connected. Chang, the man on your left, was an alcoholic, drank very heavily, constantly embarrassing his brother Eng, who was a teetotaling gentleman who read poetry. They were very different people. They didn't like each other much, and about a year before their death, Chang had a stroke, was hemiplegic, and was being dragged around by his brother, who didn't like him much. The night of their death is recorded in detail. They were traveling from one house to the other. It was a cold night. When they arrived, Chang was coughing. They went to sleep. A nephew slept with them. When the nephew woke in the middle of the night, he noticed that Chang was not moving. They woke Eng. Chang was dead, connected by a xiphoid band, which they believed was too dangerous to cut. So he said, Chang said to the nephew, "Your uncle Chang has just died. I shall now die." And he did. A very dangerous statement by any patient, of course, as we all know as doctors. I'm going to die tonight. The bodies were buried, but then exhumed by the wives, who were paid off by the Philadelphia Medical Society, which took the bodies by train to Philadelphia, where an autopsy was performed by Dr. Pancoast, William Pancoast, the father of the great radiologist whose name we all know. His report is there in the Mutter Museum, which you should visit if you've never visited in Philadelphia, where you can see the remains of the Siamese twins, which is only a plaster cast with a sign, a place where you can see the autopsy was performed. The Dr. Pancoast's report says that Chang died of a cerebral hemorrhage and Eng died of fright. He based this conclusion on his examination of the heart and lungs. Now, what could have Pancoast seen in the heart and lungs? Kurt Richter was very interested in this idea and wanted to find out. Richter was a student here under Cannon and was the heir apparent at Harvard. But as we all know, people never retire at Harvard, and there's no place for these people to move up. And so he moved to Hopkins, and he became the chair at Hopkins, chair of physiology for many years. And one of the many things he did was to try to test the Cannon hypothesis in animals. This is what, I cut out one of his papers, but I took it away. Sudden Death in Animals, it's called. It's published in 1957 in the journal Psychosomatic Medicine, in which he put rats in a situation in which they could not escape. He called it the swimming jar. They were put in a jar of water, and they had to swim without ability to escape. What he did is compare white rats, calm white rats from the lab, with wild rats trapped from the city of Baltimore. And what he found was that the wild rats would die very rapidly, and he found a cardiac lesion, which I'll refer to again in a moment. The other ones would swim until they were exhausted. They would basically never drop dead unless they drowned of exhaustion. So he was convinced that there was a cardiac lesion in animals who had been put under stress, by which he meant a life-threatening stressor with no chance of escape or control, the swimming jar. Now, it is inhumane to study this in animals and humans at the moment, certainly in humans, but even in animals, I think we would say inhumane to do this. I had a chance to talk at the University of Rochester about this many, many years ago, and there was Engel, an older man at the time. He wrote me a long letter about this, and he said, you know, you can collect experiments of nature. Just go to the newspaper and see what you find. So I started collecting them, and I just want to show you a potpourri of some of these. And once I tell you this, you're going to start seeing them every day. It's the availability heuristic. I can't tell you how many days of the week I get one from somebody, another case that they saw. Here's just a potpourri for you. Here's a woman who died during an earthquake. Earthquake is a very important natural model for this because it's a life-threatening stressor with no chance of escape or control. And earthquakes have been studied about 7 times now with Holter monitors. The sudden death rate always goes up quite predictably about 3 to 5 times for about a week after a major earthquake. You remember this case in Boston? This was a guy who lived on Mission Hill. The police broke into his house thinking he was a drug dealer, but he wasn't. He was a minister. They had gone to the wrong house. He took one look at them and dropped dead. It was a huge cause célèbre here and a racist issue against the Boston police. Here's a sad case of a man who was frightened to death by a group of these skinheads in England, working in one of those booths selling tickets in the tube, and these guys came down in all their black outfits and shook the cage in the middle of the night, and the guy dropped dead. Here's a child who died on a Disney ride. It's interesting, our language contains a lot of references to this phenomenon. These rides are supposed to scare you to death, aren't they? But most people don't think they actually do. I have 3 of these cases I've collected over the years. This is an example of a child who died on a Disney ride. Notice the spin doctors in Orlando immediately claiming it wasn't the Disney ride that did it. Can't blame them. Do you remember this? This is a recent one of a guy who broke into a house to commit a larceny. He didn't want to hurt anyone. But there was an old woman in the house. And she took one look at him. He never pulled the trigger, and she died. He was convicted of second-degree murder. He's in jail now. This happened during the Scud attacks. Sort of creepy to see this now in the modern context. Look at this back in 1991. People huddled in their basements waiting for these missiles to land on them, which they thought contained poison gas. They didn't, in fact, contain poison gas, but that didn't matter. The belief was enough. It happened after 9/11. These investigators collected the Holter monitors that people were carrying around New York City, people from New York, from Roosevelt Hospital, St. Luke's Roosevelt, and found an increased risk of sudden death. This is an interesting one. This is a guy who died of excitement during a football game. I don't know if you remember Jerome Bettis, who played for the Steelers. He was almost a certain touchdown from the 1-yard line. And this Steelers fan was in Pittsburgh in a bar, and Bettis carried the ball, fumbled. The guy leapt to his feet in the bar and said, "The Steelers kill me." And he dropped dead. Luckily, there was an EMT there who slugged him in the chest, presumably converted him from VTVF, And he woke up and ended up on a late-night television show with Dave Letterman facing Jerome Bettis, the bus. I felt sorry for Bettis, actually, who not only fumbled the ball, but almost killed one of his fans. You say, well, this is just chance, but in actual fact, these folks published an article in the New England Journal back in 2008 in which they looked at the World Cup in 2006 in Germany and compared the days on which the German team was playing versus the days that the German team was not playing to see what the risk of sudden death was. And you could see that it's 2.5 times, a little over 2.5 times greater on the days the German team was playing. All the games were played in Germany, if you remember. This sad case of a woman who heard some bad news about her child, and a young woman, only 39 years old, who had a gun held to her head, never fired, in the streets of Mexico City. A child in New Hampshire faced by a bear. The bear ran off. The child dropped dead. And now some of the more artistic ones. This guy was actually singing the words, "Too bad you can only live so long." This is an English language opera called the Macropolis Case. Dropped down. Everyone thought it was part of the show, except the actors, of course, who knew he wasn't supposed to fall down. Right at that moment, he was dead. This is one of my favorite cases. This is a fellow who worked in a morgue in Cairo, and he pulled out the slab and the body sat up, and he dropped dead. The morgue worker dropped dead, that is. Which is ironic if you think about it, because it means that the live guy ended up dead and the dead guy ended up alive in this case. We shouldn't laugh at death, but it's thalentology. What can I tell you? It happens in animals, very relatively common in racehorses who drop dead with this phenomenon, and probably neurogenic pulmonary edema, which I don't have much time to say anything about tonight, but it's a similar phenomenon. Finally, good news, as far as I can see, is just as dangerous as bad news. This man dropped dead when he heard the words "not guilty." This is one of my favorite ones. This is what George Engel called the happy ending. This guy played golf his whole life. He hit the ball over the ledge, over a rise. He couldn't see where the ball had gone. He got up there with his partner and looked down. The ball was in the hole. So he turned to his partner and he said, "I've hit a hole in one. I can die now." And he did. Here's a guy, same thing happened. He bowled a perfect game and went back to his teammates and said, "That's it, a perfect game. My life is over." Here's an example of a modern Ananias and Sapphira, religious passion. Somebody died during watching the movie The Passion, got so worked up. It's a very upsetting movie, if any of you have ever seen this movie. And she dropped dead. There were actually 3 reported cases of people dying during The Passion, watching this movie. And then there's a couple that I can't prove to you, but I have to wonder about. So here's a man who was heading to the gallows and died of a heart attack waiting. Here's a guy who was going to jail for the rest of his life, died in his jail cell waiting. I really do worry about him. And finally, on this little section, I want to show you an example of a neurocardioneurology case. Actually, 2 of them. That is the effect of the brain on the heart, which then affects the brain. Neurocardioneurology. Just a little twist on this. This is a case given me by Joel Morganlander at Duke. Collapsed, brought to the emergency department by her sister. Problem was a lethal intracerebral hemorrhage. The second sister also collapses. The residents, I'm sorry, this is not the Duke case. This is a Brigham case, actually. The residents went out and said to the sister, by the way, they were both nuns. These were sisters, 2 sisters who lived together. I now have a case of brothers, 2, but I haven't put it in my slide set yet. 2 priests who lived together, and they had the same exact thing happen, died on the same day, like Eng and Chang. But this is an amazing one because this woman collapsed with a headache. The residents did the scan. They came out. They said to the sister, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but your sister's had a terrible brain hemorrhage, and it's very unlikely that she's going to survive." The second sister went, "Oh," and collapsed, with what everyone thought was, of course, grief over the bad news, but they thought, well, they'd get a scan. So hold on your socks now, because here are the 2 scans. Sister 1 and Sister 2, sympathetic cerebral hemorrhages. even on the same side, but that one. So there's a potpourri of cases. Now, George Engel, way back in 1971, which is the year I graduated from medical school, I knew nothing about these things and didn't know that these things existed, had already said that he had found that these were the circumstances in which the sudden death phenomenon was more likely than not, or more likely than baseline. You can see what they are. I've given you examples of most of them, including the good news, the reunion triumph, the happy ending phenomenon. And another interesting phenomenon that I'm not sure I can explain, but have some idea about, and that's the so-called delay effect. That is that the peak incidence of sudden death after an acute life-threatening stressor like an earthquake is not within seconds, but actually within days. 3 to 5 days, all the earthquake data show, is the peak incidence of sudden death following an earthquake. So what accounts for a delay? So now I'm going to go to part 2, the cardiograms. So this is my first case. This is a Boston City Hospital case. You can see that it was. We used to do one lead at a time and then cut them all out with paper and stick them in the slide into the record. Some people here are old enough to remember doing cardiograms that way. So this was a cardiogram on a 29-year-old man with a subarachnoid hemorrhage. I was not a neurology resident. I knew nothing about these things. There was no neuro ICU or anything like that. So the patient was on the service with us, medical service, and we were making rounds, and this was the case. So I turned to my junior resident, that is the person 1 year ahead of me, who was a guy named Thomas Grayboys, who is a very distinguished cardiologist, who is, as you know, has written about his own diffuse Lewy body disease. I can say this, it's not HIPAA because he's written about it himself in a very compelling fashion, a wonderful person. He was my JAR. I don't know how you felt, but when I was an intern, I thought that person knew everything. So I looked at him and I said, what is this, Tom? The guy's got a bleed in his head, and he's got this very abnormal cardiogram with these deeply inverted T waves all across the precordium in almost every lead. So he looked at me, and here's the part for you, Jerry, the Casablanca part. He said 3 words, which were cerebral T waves. He said, those are cerebral T waves. And everybody else in the team seemed to know what they were talking about. They all mumbled in unison. Oh yes, cerebral T waves, they said, cerebral T waves. I went home, I looked it up in the books, and I'll show you what book in just a minute. It's a book that was actually written by my cousin, Matt Levy, and I'm going to show you what Matt Levy has done for neurocardiology. And I came back the next day and naively said, I don't understand this because we hook the leads on the limbs and across the chest. How did they get in there, those cerebral T waves? And then there was a long pause, sort of an abulic pause, and then the 3 more famous words, we see this. And as we have heard many times, and everybody all mumbled together, yes, we see this, we see this. And I went about my business, but I had to begin to think, why do we see this? That is, we hook the leads onto the limbs and across the chest. How do they get in there, those cerebral T waves? That's what I hope to explain to you in the last half hour of this. Or try to explain to you, or make some progress in explaining it to you. This was described by Harold Levine. Harold Levine was the cousin of Sam Levine, who you see right there. Sam Levine was the guy with his thumbs in his vest. He was a cardiologist here at the Brigham, really was in private practice and came over here to see a lot of patients, a very renowned cardiologist. He's in a family of cardiologists. There were a number of cardiologists in Boston. Some were at Tufts, some were here. Harold was here. He used to sit right there. I remember talking to him about this. He saw this phenomenon in somebody with a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and he reported in this journal, the American Journal of Medicine, and said that that the cardiogram in this context was not specific. He called it non-specific ST and T wave change. You've heard those words, haven't you? Anybody who can say those words can read cardiograms in any general hospital. Non-specific ST and T wave change, he said. This was not coronary disease, was his point. It's a brain thing of some kind. He thought it was an artifact, didn't represent heart disease, and that was the important aspect of it. Now there's a couple of sad things about this. Sam Levine is not remembered for this, Most of you don't, pardon me, Harold Levine is not remembered for this. Most of you probably never even heard of Harold Levine. And one of the reasons is that he didn't think of a good name for it. He did not invent the term cerebral T waves. This is a lesson that Miller Fisher taught me. Think a long time about what you're going to call something. And Fisher was a genius at that, wasn't he? 1.5 syndrome, dysarthria, clumsy hand, and so on and so forth. Who thought of the name? It was George Birch who thought of the name. Professor of medicine, the Harrison professor in New Orleans at the Charity Hospital. He saw these cases. He was obviously not a neurologist. He called them cerebrovascular accidents. Now, there were a whole potpourri of things. Some of them were probably hemorrhages, some were probably infarcts. We don't know much about what they were. The cardiogram was abnormal. Abuskov later wrote the book that almost all of us used to learn electrocardiography. He went to the University of Rochester also in the later part of his career. I had a chance to call George Birch. This is way back at the beginning of this saga. And I said to him, what do you think does this? He says, I'm sure there's a heart lesion. And I've put blood in the brains of rats and I've found heart lesions, but everybody thinks it's an artifact having to do with hypotension or something, but I'm positive there's a heart lesion. Anyhow, he died never proving that there was a heart lesion, but he believed that there was as the cause, that it wasn't an artifact. There's actually 3 major categories of electrocardiographic change that occur in the context of a neuropsychiatric catastrophe. And I've given you examples of what those catastrophes might be. Something wrong with the QT interval, the repolarization, or anything that follows the U wave, the T wave, such as a U wave. Various arrhythmias, probably because there is a prolonged QT interval, which increases the vulnerable period for an arrhythmia. And then something that looks like ischemia, and I've put that in quotes because I think we know it's not ischemia. But if a cardiogram is read by somebody who's reading by pattern recognition, they're likely to say subendocardial ischemia. Because, of course, most cardiograms that look that way are due to coronary disease. That's an error. Now, to prove that to you, I'm just going to show you a few more cases. Here's a woman who had a routine cardiogram, you could see it a long time ago, on admission to the hospital for a totally different reason. And while in the hospital, suddenly her cardiogram changed. They went to her bedside. In actual fact, it turned out that she had had a stroke, a left middle cerebral stroke with a right hemiparesis and aphasia. She was awake and alert. Her cardiogram looked like this. Here's an even more interesting case, a guy who was admitted for a barium enema. Imagine how long ago that would have been. Admitted for a barium enema. The guy had blood in his stool. So they said, come in, you're going to drink mag citrate, you're going to get a barium enema. So he comes in, and this is his admission cardiogram. It's not normal, is it? There's T-wave inversions, but they don't look like those cerebral T-waves. They look sort of sagging and asymmetrical. This was read as digeffect, and probably is digeffect. He was on dig. That's not the interesting part, though. The interesting part is that the next day, another cardiogram was done. No one knows why that cardiogram was done. It was an error, a medical error. It was not ordered. But this is what it showed. A dramatic change in repolarization. Everyone rushed to this guy's side. They wanted to know whether he was having chest pain or jaw pain. Was he short of breath? None of the above. He's drinking mag citrate. Taken to the CCU, everything canceled. And then someone notices one hand is twitching. Then the arm is twitching. Then it's clear that he's having a seizure. The neurologists are called. They try an anti-epileptic drug. It doesn't work. He goes into status epilepticus and dies. Comes in for a barium enema and dies of status epilepticus. When he was dead by brain criteria, brain dead, his cardiogram was completely normal. So the cure for the cerebral T waves is brain death. It isn't the best cure, I'll give you that, but it will sometimes work. And not only is the cardiogram normal, the remarkable thing is the digeffect is gone. So the people who think the digeffect is a direct effect on the heart, actually it's a neurocardiac phenomenon. Here's somebody with a giant U wave following a giant T wave. Potassium completely normal. It's a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Here's a wide, deep Q wave that was reversible, subarachnoid hemorrhage. And here's an amazing case. It was done by one of our colleagues here, a neurosurgeon here, doing a top of the basilar aneurysm repair. And watch what happens to the cardiogram as the surgeon starts to manipulate the neck of the aneurysm. Look at V4. You can see a bipolar T wave. the neck of the aneurysm is touched, the T wave goes up. Then it's released, the T wave goes down. This happened over and over again. They could reproduce it in a second, over and over again. Finally, they decided to clip the aneurysm. As they clipped it, the P waves disappear. The patient goes into a junctional rhythm. Luckily, does not slow down, and the whole procedure ends and ends up looking exactly like it did at the beginning. So you actually watch this thing happen during the procedure. This is a woman who came into an emergency department about 30-minute drive from here, and she had abdominal pain, and this is her cardiogram. It was normal. Tests were sent off. She began to develop some weakness and drowsiness. They packed her in an ambulance. Her cardiogram is still normal. 20 minutes later, she arrives here with cerebral T waves and is found, and when she's brain dead, it turns normal. She's found to have a hemorrhage. This is an unusual hemorrhage, as you can see. Doesn't look like a hypertensive intracerebral hemorrhage. And this is the pathology. This is a tumor that metastasized to the brain. It's a tumor of unknown primary, which bled. And when the tumor bled, she developed abdominal pain, followed by cerebral T waves. Here's a cardiogram, EEG, done on a man who was staring into space, having spells of staring into space. And I want you to watch what happens here. That's a coronal montage on the top and the double banana below. Watch the electrocardiogram as the seizure starts in the right temporal. Remember now, right temporal. A millimeter or two ST segment depression and tachycardia. 3 millimeters of ST segment depression, tachycardia. 4 millimeters of ST segment depression. Seizure comes to an end. Cardiogram turns immediately normal. A heart seizure. Seizure arising from the representation in the brain of the heart. Well, quite well known, of course, and some of them produce tachycardia, some produce bradycardias, and some stop the heart altogether. And I'll, at the end, tell you a little bit something about what is known about lateralization of that phenomenon. Here's an amazing Brigham case. A guy admitted for depression on the day that this tower over here was opened in 1980. Unfortunately, they had not locked the roof. The guy got up on the roof, and there was a 20-minute negotiation before he leapt to his death. There's no coronary disease of any significance, but if you look on the cardiac surface, you can see a hemorrhage. In actual fact, there were innumerable hemorrhages of this kind, all fresh, not tears, but acute hemorrhages of the subendocardium. And I thought I had the first such case and presented this at an international meeting, and a guy came up to me and said, "You don't have the first case, I have the first case." And he sent me this case of Weisfeld, the flying man who jumped off the Eiffel Tower and, quote, supposedly died of a heart attack. Of course, there was no pathology on that case. Wait a minute, just a second here. Now, what about other of these related phenomena? Now, sudden death during rest and sleep is a well-known phenomenon, as you probably know. The most famous of these is the sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, occurred mainly in Asian people, Cambodians, Southern Han, Chinese, Laotian, Hmong people. This has a name in virtually every language. I've listed some of the names in Filipino, in Thai, in Japanese. This is a disease by and large in young men, and often happens during sleep. These people often have reported bad dreams, nightmares, night after night, and then die in their sleep. Closely related to this is the so-called Brugada syndrome, originally described by Sidney Wolfe and Osher in 1953, popularized by Josep and Pedro Brugada in 1991. Also death in young, healthy men. These people have a polymorphic ventricular tachycardia and then probably go into ventricular fibrillation. It's probably mostly asymptomatic. Most people don't know about it, that they have it. Could happen, probably does happen during REM sleep. And there's a family of cardiac channelopathies associated with it. Sodium channel, potassium, calcium. There's the 8 Brugada syndromes, BRS 1 through 8. And again, closely related to that is probably the so-called long QT syndromes. This is another family of channelopathies which prolong repolarization, and by doing that they increase the vulnerable period during which an extra beat can cause a serious arrhythmia. There are 13 known genes for this. I've listed, these are now called LQT or long QT syndromes 1 through 13. The first 3 are the most common ones, and they were, the first one, LQT1, used to be called the Jervell and the Lang-Nielsen syndrome. This LQT3, which is a sodium channel 5 alpha mutation, is probably the Brugada syndrome 1. This is probably the same syndrome. So the long QT and the Brugada syndromes are probably very closely related channelopathies. So what is the pathology of this phenomenon? This is the heart of the patient who lived for 3 days and then died after a hemorrhage into a tumor, that tumor of unknown primary. And what you can see here, what the arrows are pointing at, are what are now most commonly called contraction bands. As you'll see in a minute, there are many names that one can use for this kind of cardiac lesion, but the most popular current name is to call this contraction band necrosis. And one of the interesting aspects of it is that you can see the necrosis here, you can see the contraction bands, and you can see there's blood in this lesion, and there are some round cells. Striking aspect of it is that it mineralizes very rapidly. This patient lived only 3 days. There was a little bit of necrosis already developing, a little bit of hemorrhage, not enough to see grossly, as we saw in the guy who jumped off the roof of the Brigham, but definitely there. So a hemorrhagic, multifocal, subendocardial, contracted lesion, mainly in the left ventricular apex and a little less in other parts of the heart. I'll show you the distribution in a minute. So let me summarize what I've told you about the cardiogram. There's actually nothing about the electrocardiogram which is above reproach. We think of the electrocardiogram as being auto-regulated, and to some extent it is. The heart, of course, has its own nervous system, and we have Starling's law of the heart. Stretch the heart and it contracts more strongly. That's auto-regulated. But there is supranuclear control, suprasegmental control over the heart, which most of the time has no deleterious effect on us. But it can produce abnormalities in every single aspect of the cardiogram, and I've actually shown you an example of every single one of these. And I won't read them to you again. But you can see first degree heart block, disappearance of the P wave, QT prolongation, T wave inversions, T wave peaking, U waves, all possible. Now, what are the characteristics of this lesion? Let's now talk about the lesion, and then finally we'll make a unifying hypothesis. This lesion is recognizable very early. In an experimental animal, this can be produced in as little as 20 minutes or so of powerful stimulation. The cells die in this contracted state. Obviously, if the person survives, they will relax and you won't see the lesion, so only acutely will you see the lesion. It elicits a mononuclear response. It's multifocal. I've already said these words. I'll say them again. Subendocardial, left ventricular apical, maximal, and sometimes hemorrhagic. It is not a myocardial infarction. Not. Many times when I've talked about this, people have gone away and said, Marty said that MIs are caused by stress. I didn't say that. There's a lot of literature, as you know, relating MIs to, quote, chronic stress, the type A personality. This subject has nothing at all to do with that. I'm not sure that that's even real. No, this is not a myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction, there is no energy. The cells do not contract. There isn't early calcification. There's a different cellular response. And there's a vascular territory, as we neurologists like to say. It's in a vascular territory. It's LAD. It's right coronary. It's circumflex. This is not. It has lots of names. These are all synonyms. Look how old some of these names are. Stofan in 1888 called this myocarditis. I think you can see why they would call it myocarditis. It is myocarditis, neurogenic myocarditis in a way. All different names as you can see here. The term we currently use is contraction band necrosis, and most of us use contraction band necrosis. But when you're reading about this, if you read about these lesions, always look at the pictures that they show, and I think you'll see the same lesion. So as I come toward the end and draw you a picture of what might be causing this and what this might mean to the rest of medicine outside of the neurocardiac connection, think for a moment about what can produce contraction band lesions in the heart. And I've summarized it here for you on this slide. There's 4 ways. Catechols can do it, either delivered from the outside or from the inside. Stress with or without steroids can do it. Stimulating the nervous system in certain places will do it. And reperfusion after a period of ischemia will do it. If you look at this at first, you probably don't see any thread that connects them. And the investigators over the decades, literally decades, who worked on this were working on different continents, writing in different languages, and people literally did not know or did not think that they were looking at one process, which I think they are. In actual fact, it's the old story of the man and the elephant, the blind man and the elephant, all working on the same problem. So let me draw that picture for you now. Just sit back in your chair, let it just roll over your right parietal lobes, and see if you can see the picture. I don't think it's possible to avoid seeing the picture if you just let it roll over you. Number one, this is caused by catechols. Look how old the original observation is, 1907. Josue chopped up adrenal grams and he injected them back into rabbits and he produced a cardiomyopathy. This was later found by Chappell with purified injections of catecholamines, and then by Reichenbach and Bendit, the cardiac pathologists from Portland, from Seattle, in a human case of pheochromocytoma, a catecholamine disease. Became known as the catecholamine cardiomyopathy, and it's a kind of excitotoxicity, not with glutamate, but with these catecholamines. I'll finish with that point. The lesion is caused by stress. I've been drawing that picture for you gradually over the last 50 minutes or so. And I trace this back to Pavlov himself, so-called fear conditioning. And a lot of the streams came from Pavlov. Two important ones were Hans Selye, who went to Canada, as you know, worked in Montreal, mostly at the French University, a little bit at McGill, but mostly at the French University of Montreal, and wrote a book, which is on my bookshelf, which is called Stress. It looks like a textbook of medicine, a big, giant, thick book like Harrison's textbook, in which he explained every known human disease based on stress. He came to believe that it was the mechanism underlying virtually everything, which is over the top. But many, many interesting ideas by Selye. And of course, Cannon, who came here. There's Selye with a lovely PowerPoint slide summarizing pretty much everything that we have talked about and what Walter Cannon has talked about. That's the target organ, T, being damaged there. And here's a wonderful Karsh photograph that was given to me by Mrs. Karsh, who's one of our patients here, of Hans Selye looking at one of his white mice. Beautiful picture of him. So that brings us to the octopus pot. This is an antique Takasubo. I have one on my table if you want to see what they look like. It's an octopus catching pot. They drop it down a long line like we would a lobster pot, put bait in it, pull it up with octopus in it. In 1991, a Japanese investigator noticed that a certain number of patients who looked as though they had myocardial infarction, actually with a primitive echocardiogram that they had dilatation of the left ventricular apex, and it looked like a Takasubo. So he called it the Takasubo-like cardiomyopathy. Here's a case history given to me by Lenny Lilly, one of our cardiologists. A typical case. A postmenopausal woman, 62-year-old woman, previously healthy. Here's some bad news. Gets chest pain, goes to an emergency department where her cardiogram is read as subendocardial ischemia. You're familiar with that now. But look at it. ST segment is pretty flat, very symmetrical T-wave inversions in the same leads we talked about before, one AVL, AVF, and flipping across the precordium. Notice that there is a leak of creatine kinase and troponin. This is a cardiac disease, not an artifact of some sort. And here's the cardiogram. You can see that the base of the heart is contracting. Some would say over-contracting, probably is over-contracting, and the apex is not doing anything, down to a 15% ejection fraction or so. An angiogram was done. The left coronary is perfectly normal. The right coronary is perfectly normal. And now you'll really see it. Sit back and just watch this. This is the ventriculogram. You're going to see that Takotsubo as clear as you possibly see, the base of the heart beating and the apex just not doing anything. Left ventricular apical ballooning, cardiac stunning, the Takotsubo-like cardiomyopathy. If you biopsy this heart, endocardial biopsy, you'll find contraction bands. This patient was lucky. Nothing bad happened to her. She did not have a bad arrhythmia. She did not rupture the left ventricle. She walked away with a benign treatment, and 2 weeks later, she was normal. Her left ventricle is contracting perfectly normally. So it is a potentially completely reversible, functional, in the real sense of the word functional, disorder. And like many of these diseases, look at the reports in the literature as a function of time. You can see this is a disease of the modern era. This is a disease which is recognizable because we have the availability of the echocardiogram. I'm sure it was always there. I feel confident that it was always there. But now it's almost epidemic in proportions, and a week doesn't go by here at the Brigham that I don't hear about another case of the Takotsubo-like cardiomyopathy. And of course, like all these, the spectrum of what it looks like has widely enlarged. And so here's a systematic review done by Gianni to give you an idea of what the disease is like. 88% women, a very interesting aspect of this, postmenopausal women, by and large, with chest pain and dyspnea like the patient I showed you. And these are the typical cardiogram changes, ST segment elevation in over 80% of them, deep inversions in 65% of them, and troponin leaks in the vast majority. So this is a heart disease. It is not necessarily benign. Our patient walked away. By definition, if you walk away, you had a good prognosis. The ones who didn't walk away are the ones who suffered sudden cardiac death of unknown cause. These are some of the causes. One of the most remarkable recent one, you can rupture the left ventricle, for example, die instantly, was this one that we had, and you can see that this patient ruptured the papillary muscle, had a Takotsubo-like cardiomyopathy, was recovering, and suddenly went into heart failure and died with a ruptured papillary muscle. That papillary muscle is filled with contraction band necrosis, killed by a neurocardiac damage. The follow-up prognosis, by and large, is pretty good. Most people do well. Their ejection fraction recovers. There's three theories. Here they are. Can you see, as neurologists, there actually is a unifying hypothesis here. Is it vessel spasm, is it myocarditis, or is it catecholamine toxicity? Which is it? Well, it isn't spasm, almost certainly. Spasm is almost never seen in these patients, very, very rarely seen. And the lesion is not the lesion of ischemia. That would look like myocardial infarction, and this does not. Microvessel function using Doppler flow wire and so on, all normal. No evidence that vasospasm and vasodilation is actually the cause of this. Is it myocarditis? Yes, it is myocarditis, but it isn't viral myocarditis, obviously, something that comes on quickly after a threat. There are inflammatory cells in this lesion, and there's some blood in the lesion. So it is a kind of myocarditis, but it's actually neurogenic myocarditis. And finally, there's no doubt that catecholamines will cause this. They're elevated in patients. One can produce this in animals by injecting catecholamines, and pheochromocytomas produce the identical situation. If you biopsy these cases, as I've shown you, you can see contraction bands. There's almost no doubt that the major underlying pathogenesis is direct catecholamine toxicity with secondary myocarditis, and maybe sometimes vasospasm and vasodilation caused by the catecholamines. So the unifying hypothesis is that it really is catecholamine toxicity with neurogenic inflammation and sometimes neurogenic vasospasm. Why does it have the shape of the Takotsubo? If you look at the density of catecholamine receptors in the heart, you can see that the left ventricle apex, that's LV3 here, has the highest number. And if you actually draw that as a picture of the heart, you can see that the catecholamine levels at the base, at the bottom of the picture, are low compared to those at the apex at the top. So I'm almost to the final hypothesis. The third piece of the puzzle. The lesion can be caused by stimulating the nervous system. Auto-stimulation, seizures like the one I showed you, or external stimulation by experimentors who have produced this lesion in animals. Here's a picture from Stephen Oppenheimer, a neurocardiologist who I think worked with Cliff at one time. I'm pretty sure he did, showing that he could stimulate the insula and produce ST segment depressions, elevations, or Q waves, coming and going at his will, depending on where he stimulated, and he could produce a cardiac lesion in 20 minutes on the right as compared to a control on the left by stimulating in the central nervous system along those pathways. And you can actually see at the microscopically that the catecholamine is probably killing that fiber M1 by excitotoxicity. So the final piece of the four-piece puzzle is reperfusion, the one that I think is the least intuitively obvious. But cardiologists have known for a long time that reperfusion after ischemia is a dangerous time. Gene Braunwald, who was right there looking down at us, and Bob Kloner in 1985 published a paper in the JCI in which they talked about reperfusion in cardiology as being a double-edged sword. That we needed to reperfuse the heart, of course, but when they reperfused the heart, there was a period of reperfusion arrhythmias, which we're now seeing an analog of in the brain, ischemia and reperfusion of the brain, now that we're doing the same thing. What could be the mechanism of this? I think the main concept that I want to transmit to you is the calcium and oxygen paradox. The paradox meaning if you deprive myofilaments in vitro of calcium, they will become weak. The same is true of oxygen, of course, and if you reperfuse, you would expect them to improve, but paradoxically, they contract and will not relax. This is what Denton Cooley called the stone heart. That's the entire heart doing this. I actually recently talked to Cooley about this as I was interviewing him for another reason and asked him why he called it the stone heart. And he said it just looked like a stone. They would reperfuse the heart would contract, they couldn't relax, cause it to relax. What he didn't know, of course, is that it really was a stone, that this was calcium inside the, now that wasn't why the heart was hard. It was hard because it was contracting. So there's the four-piece puzzle. You're neurologists, of course. Everybody here can see that there's a unifying hypothesis. I'll just draw it as a cartoon for you, and we'll finish with a few final thoughts. So this is taken from Truex. This is a highly cartooned version of the innervation of the heart. I like it because it's obviously drawn by somebody who's neurophilic. Look at the relative size of the heart and brain in this picture. I think this is the appropriate relationship between the heart and brain. But you can see the insula there, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, a lot of the connections in the brainstem, which we're not going to go into today. And then finally, the connections from the intermediate lateral cell column through the stellate ganglion to the heart. This work really started with Cliff Saper, who's sitting here in the second row. He was one of the first, if not the first, with Chiquetto to actually map the sensory cardunculus, where the heart fibers go in the brain, in the insula. And this is a nice summary in 1991 of this work that was published in a journal called the Journal of Comparative Neurology, which I think we've heard of. My final comments are about the asymmetry. I'll start with just a few facts, unequivocal facts, and then leave you with a couple of unknowns. There's no doubt that stimulation of the left stellate ganglion lengthens the QT interval, that it increases arrhythmias by increasing the vulnerable period, and that the right stellate does exactly the opposite. The ablations of these structures does the mirror image. So ablation of the right stellate is like stimulating the left. The QT interval prolongs. Increased vagatonia counteracts sympathetic activity. The vagus is by and large the good guy in this story, though there are vagal deaths as well. That is to say, the heart can slow and even stop, for example, in certain seizures. The left vagus supplies the SA node and the AV node and all the way down into the left ventricle, and the right stops at the AV node. So there's an asymmetry in vagal stimulation. And that discovery was made by Matt Levy, my cousin Matt. And he actually taught me to do these experiments in a dog by putting a balloon, a little finger cot, inside the left ventricle, hooking it to a strain gauge, pacing the heart so the heart cannot slow, and then stimulate the left vagus and then the right vagus. And what you learn is that the contractile force, that is, it's a negative inotropic effect, even though the heart rate is constant, if you stimulate the left vagus, so that the left vagus does not stop at the AV node as had been taught until that time. In general, right insular ablative lesions increase sympathetic tone, presumably by disinhibiting sympathetic tone. But if you noticed, I presented a case to you of a right temporal seizure with a tachycardia and ST segment depression. I purposely wanted you to see that this final statement is equivocal. And I think the reason for that is the specific location with the insula, anterior or posterior insula. It's going to make a huge difference. What are the implications of this? These are, again, facts, and I'll leave you with some questions. Vagal neuropathies increase the risk for sympathetic overactivity. Diabetes mellitus would be the most common vagal neuropathy. It's a long fiber neuropathy. This is a very long nerve. And one of the signs of it is, of course, is loss of the sinus arrhythmia, which is what the autonomic people do to measure it. Left insular seizures and right hemisphere strokes do have greater sympathetic tone than their opposites on average. And work that Vladimir Hachinsky and John Norris have done a long time ago, I think clearly shows that right hemisphere insular lesions do carry a higher risk of cardiac arrhythmia in the immediate post-stroke period. Now, why that is, we don't exactly know, but that is a fact. And finally, other organs are at risk for this same series of problems, including the bowel, Cushing's ulcer, Harvey Cushing's ulcer, that's Harvey up there, that he noticed when after these operations some people would have a shallow stomach ulcer which would bleed enormously. There are kidney lesions, eye lesions, and even lesions in glucose metabolism. That is to say, increased sympathetic activity can increase blood sugar. So the effects can be very protean, and the most well-known of these I'm not going to talk about tonight, and that's neurogenic pulmonary edema, an effect on the blood-lung barrier, which is very direct and very specific to overaction of the sympathetic tone. So there's the vagus coming toward the heart, the solid lines, the sympathetics here, and then I just want to use this slide to point out one issue here. You can see that there's the efferent limb on your left and the afferent limb on your right, but the main point I want to show here is not only is there an afferent limb, but there's also an asymmetry between the two sides, which at the moment is, I would say, is somewhat unpredictable. I wouldn't be able to predict in advance if a right temporal seizure would cause overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system or not. There's the heart talking back to the central nervous system. These are the cardiac reflexes, so that there is actually a feedback loop to the central nervous system. And then this is taken from Reynolds' book on this subject, in which he tries to draw the entire cascade from the limbic cortex above through the basal ganglia, through the brainstem connections to the intermediate lateral cell column, the vagus nucleus, and so on. Just a diagrammatic way of showing you that the heart is just a piece of the end of the nervous system. At the heart's level, this process probably opens a calcium channel, which causes a contracture, and that calcium damages myocytes, the conducting system, and cardiac vessels, all of which are innervated by these nerves. We now know why it looks like a Takotsubo, I think, with a high degree of certainty. That has to do with the distribution of these receptors in the left ventricle. So in the apex, epinephrine is the big catechol. It comes from the blood, that is from the adrenal and the blood. At the base, it's norepinephrine, which is the dominant catecholamine. It comes from the sympathetic fibers. And this is a drawing of it taken from Leon's paper in Nature Clinical Practice, showing the dominance of the epinephrine in the apex and the norepinephrine at the base, which is probably why in the typical case of the central nervous system type Takotsubo, that fright that causes it, the base of the heart overcontracts and the apex of the part undercontracts. However, if the catechols come from another source, such as from the blood or from the patient's abuse of reuptake inhibitors or catecholaminergic substances, then the shape will not necessarily be that of the Takotsubo. But it can be any shape, left ventricular asymmetries of different kinds. You can even have an inverted Takotsubo with a contracting apex and a relaxed base. What kills the cells? No one knows for sure, but it could be free radicals. This is one free radical, adrenochrome, which is a metabolite of catecholamines, and we know that it can dissolve membrane. I want to give credit here to the man on your left. That's Felix Zelmanovich Meyerson, who is a direct intellectual descendant of Pavlov, and whose work really was quite remarkable and advanced in thinking about free radical toxicity in the myocardium. I look a little bit different in that picture. When I finally met Felix Meyerson, he's now passed away. And this is a cartoon from his book showing his theory of how catecholamines could damage the myocardium and cause the leakage of the CK, and now we would say troponin. He didn't know about troponin, and the pouring down the concentration gradient of the calcium, turning the muscle to stone, the stone heart. So here's a final cartoon of what I've tried to tell you or lead you through in the last hour or so. Something in the central or peripheral nervous system leads to this a catecholamine storm. It can come from the blood, that is from the adrenals in the blood, or from something the person has taken, like the use of cocaine or methamphetamine, or be released from the central nervous system. The local catechol excess opens the calcium channel. That causes the contracture, the change in the cardiogram that we like to call the cerebral T wave. That's reversible. If a person recovers at this stage, we would presume there would be no lesion in the heart. But if it continues untreated or ongoing in any other way, then free radical release, calcium peroxidation, calcium inundation, peroxidation of the membrane, inundation of the cell with calcium, and death of the cell. And as I told you, not everybody survives the Takotsubo-like cardiomyopathy. Here's my list, circa 2014, of what I think of as the neurocardiac diseases. I've mentioned a lot of them to you in the last hour or so. The phenomenon, in a minimalist way, is probably extremely common in a big general hospital and even in the general public, but it's not generally noticed for the reasons that are obvious to us. It's lost in the myocardial infarctions and the other non-specific ST and T wave changes, and never noticed to actually be there. Can we do something about it? No, we can't do anything about it. It happens too fast. It happens within a microsecond. There's no warning, and we can't know when to expect it. Now, if you are in a situation in which you might expect it to happen, theoretically, you could give a GABA agonist, like a benzo, or you could block the catecholamine receptors with a beta blocker or an alpha blocker or both, or you could block lipid peroxidation, or you could give a calcium entry blocker. But is it realistic to have everybody walking around with a handful of these pills? Of course, the cardiologists are already doing this. This is a familiar concoction of pills that we all recognize, given to our patients by cardiologists. But if we're faced with somebody with a right hemisphere, right insular stroke, somebody with a subarachnoid hemorrhage, it seems reasonable that one might be able to make some effect, beneficial effect. Is it true? Are there any studies that would really prove that it would work? I would say no, not at this moment. It would be theoretical. In sum of what I've told you, going all the way back to the beginning, I would say that this phenomenon that we've talked about is actually not a disease. It's the action of the limbic brain. It's a small, very small downside risk of what is overwhelmingly a very advantageous system. The system that allows us to anticipate a potential stressor without foreseeing it, to just imagine that there might be a stressor and prepare for it. It's hard to imagine that we would ever wipe this problem out, but under certain circumstances, of course, it's conceivable that we could alter the severity of it in high-risk situations. So I've taken you on a long tour all the way back to the beginning of thinking about the connection between the brain and the heart. I hope you've enjoyed it, and for those of you who have seen it before, you've heard some of the lines that you expected to hear. And I end by thanking you all again for allowing me to present this to you here, and especially in this location. So thank you all. Can I ask for one or two comments? Cliff, would you like to make a remark? You're obviously very knowledgeable about this business.
Well, I became interested in it the same way that you did, around the same time of my career, and read a lot of this literature very early on. And so I think you really put it together exactly right. I think it's amazing that so few people, particularly in the cardiology field, have actually picked up on this.
If it weren't for the Takasubo, I think we would really be in trouble, because I think they have bought into that. They can see it with their eyes, and they believe that that actually exists. Yeah. Anybody have any other remarks, comments, views, opinions? Yes, please.
Yes, what's the evidence that you've seen in children? Because we see a lot of kids who would see that, or we always have that in the back of our minds. You brought up the picture of the EEG with the EKG simultaneously. Would that be something that has been kind of seen in children as well?
There are children who have been reported. I described one or two of them to you, relatively young people who've had it happen. People with no coronary disease, young people without any conduction system disease, even at autopsy. So there's no question it happens in children. I can't tell you anything more than that about it. Does it have anything to do with SIDS? I listed SIDS as one of the potential diseases. As I'm sure you know, the cardiology community has been very interested in these calcium, potassium, and sodium channel mutations in some families where there is SIDS. So I think that some of those deaths are probably neurocardiac, but others are probably respiratory or some other unknown cause. So I don't know that much about this disease in children, but I know it can occasionally occur.
Marty, what about SUDEP you also had up there as a potential pediatric, although it happens in adults as well. But those kind of phenomenon may be caught on EEG, and you have your electrocardiogram at the same time. And is there any evidence that vagal nerve stimulation is a protective effect against?
Yeah, it's something I should have mentioned as it was in my mind, but I let it go out. I'm glad you asked me. I don't know. One thing is I don't know how vagal nerve stimulation works. I don't know what it's doing. If it's doing anything, it must be doing something, but it's not. I don't know how it works. I think of it as a wire connected to the reticular formation. You guys are just stimulating a wire that goes to the reticular formation. I don't know how it works, and I certainly don't know that at the frequencies that you stimulate, what effect that would have on the heart, and whether the left versus the right would make any difference. Theoretically, you could slow the heart, but whether it would protect you against this problem in the left ventricle. Remember, it's the left vagus only that gets into the left ventricle. So, theoretically, it's good for you. The vagus is good for you. Fewer people are dying of the heart slowing than the ones having than having tachyarrhythmias. But I don't know how the thing works. Does anybody know how it works? How does VNS work? It's a magical thing. I don't know.
How about one more question?
Predictable potential situations. Does pharmacology have any role in it, like blockers?
Yeah, well, there's a guy named Robert Elliott, deceased now, who made his career around trying to recognize people who were at risk for bad cardiac arrhythmias. And he actually devised something called the stress tolerance test. It was his version of the exercise tolerance test. So he would hook you up to autonomic testing devices, see whether you sweat with a galvanic skin response. He'd measure pupils, measure your heart rate, and then he would show people a series of pictures, stimuli, spiders, pair of dice, and he tried to divide the entire world into two groups, what he called hot reactors and cold reactors. So when you show the person the spider, some people get a tachycardia, some people don't get a tachycardia. And he then followed them to see what would happen. And of course there was no difference. And nothing ever came of it. You couldn't predict, based on what you did in the neuropsychologist laboratory, what would actually happen in the physiological circumstance. That to me is one of the most interesting aspects of this, because a lot of people say, well, why don't we just test this in the lab? The problem with it is, in order to test people, you actually have to tell them that it's a game, don't you? It would be unethical to say, you know, we're going to shock you and we might kill you. We might kill you. I can't tell you in advance whether we're going to kill you or not. Or we might kill you. Right? You couldn't do that. But you know, so that's a big problem, because by saying to the person, this is a game, all the conditions are changed. And I'm sure Alvaro could tell us why. All the conditions are changed, but once you know that this is a game, it's not the same as those poor rats that Richter had, who he had swimming in there, and it was not a game. And they died. I think that that's a big difference between the experimental circumstance. You were going to say something about that, Cliff.
I was going to say that one of the circumstances where we see this is in the CCU. You have people who are hooked up
Absolutely.
to cardiac monitors, and they have a tendency to go into arrhythmias as the professor goes around and rounds.
That's right, especially Denny Brown or somebody like that.
This is seriously true.
Yeah.
And this is something that Bernard Blount was interested in. He and Richard Verrier here did experiments where they took dogs and they put them in slings and were stressed to them, and they put cuffs around the coronary arteries to see if they could. And what they found is when you stress them and there was coronary ischemia, that's when they would get arrhythmias.
Yeah.
It's very hard to predict what would exactly happen. People in an ICU have all kinds of different arrhythmias.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope everybody heard that point about Lown and Verrier, who did a lot of very interesting experiments. And there's another guy named Skinner, Skip Skinner, who may still be in business, who did experiments with pigs. You know, pigs are the most humanoid animal in the barnyard. They have a cardiovascular system that's very much like ours, which is why I think we use pigs' hearts to replace valves. And they are neurotic, like we are. They're nervous, they're easily frightened. I don't know whether you knew this, but when the farmers take the pigs to the market, they lose about 10% of them in the truck. And they know this in advance. And in fact, at some point in the past, they've tried to pre-treat them with propranolol to try to increase the yield on these pigs. They were so anyhow, he would take them into the lab and tighten the coronary to make a little bit of ischemia. And the animals that were just brought in from the farm to his lab and were very frightened would have an arrhythmia. Then he would reverse the arrhythmia. He'd shock them. They would be better. Then after they got used to being in the lab, and they thought that, unfortunately not true, but they thought that that Skip Skinner was their friend, he could produce the ischemia, and they didn't have an arrhythmia. They weren't frightened anymore. So I mean, I think there's something to it, but the problem is predicting in a complicated human organism what they're going to do when the real event happens, right? So I'm going to go and get my car afterwards. If a person were to come up to me and say, your money or your life, not a game, what would happen, actually? It's completely unpredictable, isn't it? How would you react in a situation like that? How does anybody predict how somebody's going to react? Should I be taking propranolol, a calcium blocker, Valium every day of my life on the chance that somebody's going to hold a gun to my head? No, I think that would be crazy. And of course, finally, we neurologists know that there's a lot of things worse than sudden death. You know, we laugh today about death. We're laughing about the guy in the morgue and all the rest. But the reality, of course, is that compared to what we deal with, this is the good news. And people say, how can you study this? It's so depressing. It's thalentology. You know, you're studying death. Yeah, but you know, I see ALS and stroke and Parkinson's disease every day. This is the good news, right, Jim? I think we should probably stop. I really appreciate your comment. Thank you.